The ceasefire agreement in Gaza that went into effect on April 15th was celebrated across Western media as a diplomatic breakthrough, a pause in the violence, an opportunity for humanitarian relief. That narrative is not exactly wrong, but it's incomplete to the point of being misleading, because what almost no one is discussing, what's absent from the analysis you're seeing in mainstream outlets, is that the ceasefire wasn't just a pause, it was a strategic repositioning that Iran orchestrated, and the implications of that repositioning are only now becoming visible. Let me walk you through what actually happened and why the next 90 days are more dangerous than the 18 months of active conflict that preceded them. Start with context, because the Gaza conflict didn't happen in isolation. From Iran's perspective, and you can verify this through statements from Supreme Leader Khamenei, from IRGC commanders, from the Supreme National Security Council, this was never just about Palestine. It was about demonstrating that the regional order established after the Abraham Accords, where Israel normalizes with Arab states and isolates Iran, was fragile. The theory was that sustained resistance, even at enormous cost to Gaza, would expose the contradictions in that order. And they were right. Saudi normalization with Israel, which was reportedly weeks away in September 2023, is now indefinitely postponed. UAE and Bahrain, which had normalized, are conducting quiet outreach to Tehran. Egypt and Jordan are more critical of Israel than they've been in decades. The map of regional alignment shifted. But here's what's less understood. Iran's strategic goal was never to win a military victory in Gaza. Hamas doesn't have the capability to defeat the IDF. Iran's goal was to impose costs on Israel, costs that were disproportionate to what Israel gained, and to sustain those costs long enough that Israel's decision makers would accept an outcome that leaves the resistance infrastructure partially intact. The ceasefire does exactly that. Yes, there's been massive destruction in Gaza. Yes, Hamas's military capabilities are degraded, but they're not eliminated. The command structure survived. The tunnel networks are partially operational, and crucially, the political legitimacy of the resistance has been enhanced, not destroyed. Now pay attention to the timing. The ceasefire was announced 48 hours after a series of coordinated attacks on US bases in Syria and Iraq that were attributed to Iranian-backed militias. Those attacks weren't random. They were calibrated to remind the US that escalation has costs beyond the immediate theater. Then, within a week of the ceasefire taking effect, Iran announced that it had successfully enriched uranium to 63% purity at its Fordow facility. That's not weapons grade, which is 90%, but it's close enough that the breakout time, the time needed to produce enough material for a weapon, is measured in weeks, not months. Connect a third data point. On April 22nd, Lebanese Hezbollah conducted military exercises near the Israeli border that displayed anti-tank capabilities, including Cornet missiles and indigenous systems, in quantities that exceeded previous intelligence assessments. The footage was released publicly, not hidden. That's a signal. It says, we have the capability, we're willing to demonstrate it, and the next phase of this conflict could involve fronts that Israel hasn't had to seriously contest in Gaza. The announcement structure here is critical to understand. The first announcement was the ceasefire itself, framed as a diplomatic achievement. The second announcement was the uranium enrichment, signaling that Iran's nuclear program advanced during the Gaza conflict, not stalled. The third announcement was the Hezbollah exercises, indicating that the broader axis of resistance is prepared for escalation if Israel attempts to use the ceasefire to reconstitute and then restart operations. Taken together, these aren't separate events, they're a coordinated communication strategy. Now let's talk about what the ceasefire actually enables from Iran's perspective. First, it freezes the conflict at a point where Hamas remains viable. If Israel had continued operations for another 6 months, they might have achieved sufficient degradation of Hamas capabilities that reconstruction would be genuinely difficult. The ceasefire prevents that outcome. Second, it creates a timeline for reconstruction and rearmament. The tunnel networks that were damaged can be repaired. The weapons stocks that were depleted can be replenished, primarily through smuggling routes that Egypt is either unable or unwilling to fully close. Third, it shifts international focus to reconstruction and humanitarian aid, which means funds flowing into Gaza, some of which will inevitably be diverted to rebuilding resistance infrastructure. Israel's strategic position coming out of this ceasefire is more complex than the public narrative suggests. Yes, they inflicted significant damage. Yes, they demonstrated military capability. But they didn't achieve the stated objective of eliminating Hamas. They didn't rescue most of the hostages. They didn't restore deterrence, if anything. They demonstrated that sustained resistance can impose costs that Israel finds difficult to absorb. And critically, they're now in a position where resuming operations would be politically costly internationally and domestically without clear evidence that Hamas violated the ceasefire. Iran and Hamas understand this. The ceasefire terms are deliberately ambiguous in ways that give Hamas flexibility while constraining Israeli responses. Here's the complication, and it's a significant one. The ceasefire is fragile. Violations are occurring daily, though low level. The question is what threshold triggers a resumption of major operations. If Israel sets the bar too low, they look like they're rejecting a peace they just agreed to. If they set the bar too high, they accept provocations that erode deterrence. Iran and Hamas have an interest in testing that threshold, in finding the maximum level of activity they can conduct without triggering full Israeli response. That testing process is inherently escalatory. There's also internal Israeli pressure. There are constituencies, both in the government and in the military, that view the ceasefire as a strategic error. They argue that stopping operations before achieving complete dismantlement of Hamas means the war will have to be refought under less favorable conditions. They're not entirely wrong, but the counter-argument is that continuing operations had diminishing returns and increasing costs. Both perspectives have validity, and the tension between them shapes what Israel does next. The counter-narrative that's important to understand is that Iran's strategy is not cost-free. They've invested enormous resources in supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, and other proxy forces. Those resources could have been used domestically. The Iranian population is aware of this, and there's resentment, particularly among younger demographics, about prioritizing regional resistance over economic development. Additionally, Iran's nuclear escalation brings it closer to a threshold that could trigger Israeli or American military action. That's a risk, and it's one that not all Iranian decision-makers are comfortable with. There are debates within Tehran about whether this strategy serves Iranian national interests or whether it's driven more by ideological commitment than rational cost-benefit analysis. But from the perspective of Iran's security establishment, and you can verify this through their public statements and doctrinal documents, the logic is straightforward. Israel, backed by the United States, represents an existential threat. Direct confrontation is not viable given the conventional military imbalance. Therefore, the strategy is to build a network of allied forces across the region that can impose costs on Israel from multiple directions, forcing Israel to fight on multiple fronts, while Iran itself remains behind a buffer of allied territory. Gaza was a test of that strategy. The fact that Hamas survived 18 months of intensive Israeli operations validates the approach from their perspective, and this connects to a historical parallel that's instructive. In the 1980s, the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan. The United States, through Pakistan, armed and trained the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen couldn't defeat the Soviet army in conventional battle, but they could impose continuous costs, force the Soviets to spread their forces thin, create casualties that eroded domestic support, and ultimately make the occupation unsustainable. The Soviet Union withdrew not because they were militarily defeated, but because the cost of staying exceeded the value of the objective. Iran studied that conflict carefully. Their strategists cite it explicitly. The goal in Gaza isn't to win battles. The goal is to make Israel's victories so expensive that the strategic objective becomes unattainable. So where does this go? 3 scenarios worth serious consideration. Scenario 1, unstable ceasefire. The agreement holds nominally, but low-level violations continue. Israel conducts limited strikes in response, but doesn't resume full operations. This creates a frozen conflict that periodically flares but doesn't escalate to the intensity of the previous phase. Both sides use the time to reconstitute capabilities. The real conflict resumes in 12 to 18 months under conditions more favorable to Hamas than if Israel had continued operations now. This is the most likely trajectory based on current dynamics. Scenario 2, ceasefire collapse. A significant violation occurs, possibly a hostage situation, possibly a major rocket attack that creates domestic pressure in Israel that the government can't resist. Operations resume, but this time Hezbollah intervenes from the north, creating a two-front war that Israel is less prepared for. US involvement becomes more likely but not certain. The regional conflict that everyone has been trying to avoid becomes unavoidable. Probability is moderate and increases over time if Scenario 1 proves unstable. Scenario 3, negotiated consolidation. The ceasefire holds long enough that international pressure and economic incentives create a framework for longer-term arrangements. This doesn't mean peace, it means managed conflict with agreed-upon red lines. Israel accepts that Hamas will remain a factor in Gaza. Iran gets implicit recognition of its regional role. This would require all parties accepting less than their maximum objectives, which is politically difficult but not impossible if the alternatives are clearly worse. Probability is low in the current environment, but increases if Scenario 2 demonstrates that escalation costs are genuinely unacceptable. What's certain is that the ceasefire was not an end. It was a phased transition in an ongoing strategic competition. Iran played a longer game than most analysts recognized. They accepted short-term costs both to their proxies and to their own resources in service of longer-term strategic positioning. Whether that calculation proves correct depends on what happens in the next quarter. But the indicators suggest that Iran believes the trajectory is favorable, and their behavior, the nuclear escalation, the Hezbollah demonstrations, the diplomatic outreach to Arab states, is consistent with a belief that they have strategic momentum. This isn't advocacy for any particular outcome. This is analysis based on observable patterns, on documented statements, on the revealed preferences of actors based on their behavior rather than their rhetoric. The trap wasn't hidden. It was visible to anyone paying attention to what Iran was actually doing, rather than what Western analysis assumed Iran could do. The question now is whether Israeli and American decision-makers recognize the strategic reality, or whether they continue operating on assumptions that are empirically outdated. The next 90 days will provide the answer, and based on the pattern of the last 18 months, the costs of getting that answer wrong are substantial.